And the police on campus and the administration police have been targeting Carlos from the beginning of the strike. So we must unite as a community and stand behind him, stand with him. We must demand an end to the racist processes that have been so harmful to Carlos and will ultimately be more harmful to any cause that resist the UC in the future. So if you haven't had a chance to read about, look into, please research a little bit more about our campaign, our boycott.
Yeah, we also want to say there's so much happening right now. So if you feel so inclined, if you got spare change, spare time, spare skills, to please contact us to get involved with the myriad sort of struggles that are going on at the University of California, or if you'd like to find some way to partner up, share skills, spread knowledge, and all that good stuff.
Just so folks know, for the Q&A following our talk today, please drop a private message to myself with any questions you may have. And so I'm going to be relaying them at the allotted Q&A time. But this way, if folks have overlapping questions, I can kind of connect some dots for folks and do some framing context behind any questions for our audience members who have varying degrees of knowledge. So please message me. You can find my name, Bree Bird, 2 B's, can't be hard to find. And I'll be in charge of your questions. And if you have a question about language during Professor King's talk, that can also come to me, and we can do that right there, and then send it out. What else?
So to get in contact or to see recordings of previous talks, you can head to fucseries.org or contact us at colaorparish@gmail.com.
So now that we've done our background and give you some context of the FUC, our online speaker series, we are honored to have with us today Dr. Tiffany Lethabo King from Georgia State University, and Samasu is going to say a few words.
All right. So Dr. Tiffany Lethabo King's dynamic and manifold contributions to Black study reverberate across Black spaces of communalism and struggle, much like Saidiya Hartman's chorus, meaning her work is a phonic prism for the circulation, transformation, and transubstantiation of Black and Indigenous thought and practices of world making and ending. Dr. King's work provides not so much an intervention, but instead a choreographic and arrangement of the grounds and waters from which the rubric of conquest has been disavowed, erased, and made opaque in the institutionalization of settler colonial studies. Her treatment of conquest as a, quote, conceptual and material terrain, end quote, that violently constitutes the corrosive, self-actualizing processes of Sylvia Wynter's Euro-Christian modern man, demands continued engagement with the afterlife of, or perhaps the ghost of, or perhaps the atemporal fractal instantiations of conquest, slavery, and genocide that underwrite state and intramural violence.
Today's talk, Beyond Work, Black and Indigenous Feminist Critiques of Work as Being, comes a year and some change after the publication of Dr. King's monograph, The Black Shoals, Offshore Formations of Black and Native Studies, a work that asks us to take seriously the capaciousness of the Black radical tradition, the haptic as a space of knowing and joining, and understand that in engaging our own histories as Black folks, we see that many worlds, worldings, paths, connections, and shoals were, are, and will be possible. Focusing on today's topic, we are excited to be thinking with Dr. King beyond the category of labor towards the fungible and the fugitive. We are so grateful to have you with us today. Everyone, Dr. King.
Bree and Samasa, I have never, thank you for those introductions and that particular like taking up an engagement with my work. I gotta get it y'all to maybe blurb my next book. That was incredible. Thank you all so much. Thank you for hosting this. Thomas, thank you for the invitation. I've been following this series closely. I'm about to watch the one on abolishing the family. So I love the conversations you all are sustaining, and particularly bringing abolition to the table to have a conversation with organized labor. It can be an uncomfortable one, but one nonetheless we need to have. And I'll definitely check in with my chapter of United Campus Workers at Georgia to make sure we have sent a statement of solidarity of the boycott. We might have, may have not, and also financial support. So I love what y'all are doing. Thank you so much. And look forward to the conversation after I present. So I'm gonna talk for about 30 minutes. I'm gonna share my screen here. Can folks see this? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can? Okay, cool. So let me talk a little bit about getting beyond work for me and how I came to this. In the Black Shoals, if folks haven't read it, and the way that Bree described to us in the framing kind of this conversation, in chapter 3, I critique work through the Caribbean scholar Shona Jackson, particularly her critique of work in Creole indigeneity, and I use Sadia Hartman's articulation of fungibility to think about what labor crowds out when we look at a plantation scene, when we look at bodies on a plantation, right? And I've had some pushback from some Marxists, both defensive and generative, about that critique of labor. And they said, well, you didn't take on Marx. And I was like, I didn't intend to. My conversation wasn't with Marx, it was with Black feminists, and hopefully is becoming more intimate with Native feminists. But I was encouraged to think a little bit more closely with the 1844 manuscript that some people call the Paris Papers, but the economic and philosophic manuscript that Marx pens in 1844. And I appreciate Jody Jean's engagement to say, well, go back to that again and look at that a little bit more closely. And I have actually enjoyed the process of rereading Marx through Black and Indigenous feminist thought. I wish I could be in class with Samasa and Frank, because y'all take up Marx seriously, particularly Das Kapital, which I'm just getting back to. But it's been a generative process, because what I'm noticing when I take seriously, particularly the work of Shona Jackson, Denise Ferreira da Silva, who I'm going to talk about a little bit, even some older work, Claudia Jones's stuff, and some Indigenous feminist thinkers like Leanne Simpson, there is a way that they pick at and challenge work to reveal some of its ontological violences and the kind of residual liberalisms it holds on to, right? That it's held on to, particularly in the left, from that early configuration of Marx in 1844 all the way to today. And we find that residue, particularly in the ways that the democratic socialists of America articulate work and the value of work, right? And so what I'm arguing is a critical rereading of Marx with Black feminist thought, with Afro-pessimist thought, and with Indigenous feminists. Like, there needs to be some reciprocity. I know that the DSA is not doing reading groups on Native feminists or Black feminists. If you just check out some of the conversations they've had on that Socialism 2020 conversation with Robin D.G. Kelly, it was very disrespectful. The comments were very disrespectful. And there's a lot of reading that they need to do, and a lot of unpacking of their investment in work. Even work in its unalienated and unestranged form has some problems that Black feminists and Native feminists unravel for us. And they really, the reason why this work is so important is because they link the ontological to the material. There's no way that you can really fully articulate or theorize material violence without understanding the ontological categories that people, particularly white workers, invest themselves in, and then the kind of violence that allows them to do materially in the world. So there needs to be some reciprocity and a reading of Indigenous feminists, right? So put in the work. I appreciate the work. I don't agree with all the statements in this newer, this important document that came out of the Red Nation. It was called Communism is the Horizon, and Queer and Indigenous Feminisms is the Way. And it came out of their 2019 Native Liberation Conference. And I appreciate the work that they do. And they professed a commitment to revolutionary socialism, which is very different than what the DSA is doing. But the kind of work that they put into it to be patient and deliberate with communism is the kind of work that uncritical Marxists and folks that are very hostile to Black folks and Black thought need to be putting into Black study and study with Indigenous theorists. So I'm gonna talk to you about some of the people that I think with. Shona Jackson is producing some incredible work now that I just found out about. She's going to return to Cedric Robinson and rethink the category work a lot, give it some more time than she did in Creole indigeneity. But what she did in Creole indigeneity was fascinating to me, because she's taking on the ontoepistemology of work, or specifically labor, let me use her words, labor, and what articulating yourself and knowing yourself through labor, what it actually does, what it allows you to think about yourself, and how it allows you to move in the world. And in the Anglophone Caribbean, specifically Guyana, she thought about how this post-colonial Black subject thought themselves through work and who it erased, right? What kinds of people who were not working were erased, and also the ways that Amerindian modes of being were erased, right? So she's cautious about this category of labor on an ontoepistemological level, right? And the erasures that it enacts. In that book, she says that she doesn't want to get beyond labor, but I think she's going somewhere else in the newer work. And I'm excited to see that. And then Denise Ferrer da Silva has been thinking a long time about these pillars of Western thought, particularly determinacy, separability, sequentiality. And in her newer work, which I had the privilege of being able to read an early version of, it's Raising the Dead, a chapter in Otherwise Worlds. She's thinking about Marx's configuration and theorization of value, particularly the labor theory of value, and why it cannot account for enslaved bodies, which are seen as raw material, right? Not as people, and also the genocide of Indigenous people, right? So the very ways that Marx even relies on a particular kind of violent determinacy and separability and sequentiality is something I want to take more seriously in the work that I'm doing. And I'm going to focus on separability and how that functions in Marx's 1844 configuration of work in a moment. And then I'm going to end with Leanne Simpson and some work that she did in As We Have Always Done, and specifically think about her Anishinaabeg anti-capitalism and how she resists in a story of Anishinaabe making and what she calls discovery, and how that scene resists some of Marx's ontological statements of passive land and animals and active humans. So that's where I'm going to go today. So I think if folks are familiar with this passage from the Economic and Philosophic manuscript, it's in the first manuscript at the end, where Marx is thinking about estranged labor. And so in this passage, in the first line, there is an articulation of ideal labor, what labor can do in its most kind of creative, unfettered kind of capacity, right? And so just from thinking with the first few words before the comma, it is just in his work upon the objective world. You can already see a kind of ontological hierarchy where man works upon. And I'm gonna think later with a Black feminist and queer theorist, Kemi Adeyemi, who talks about orientation. So it's thinking through degrees. And so I would argue, Adeyemi would say that this worker has a 90-degree orientation to the ground that is at 0, right? And so that's a hierarchical kind of orientation through degrees. And I love the way that they do that. But there is this working upon an objective world that is separated, right? Again, thinking with the Silva, this critical separation that has to happen to create man as an autonomous individual, right? In order for man to become, if we go to the second line, a species being, that if we're thinking with, and I love thinking with this person now, Zakiya Jackson, about how speciesism has to emerge alongside race, or race in fact creates the grounds for species to emerge in biology. Species being is already a racialized statement, right? And so if we go to that confession of faith that the communist has in the Communist Manifesto, in those questions that communists were training one another with in 1848, when they're saying, how is a slave different from the proletariat? Well, Marx and Engels say, right, that the slave is a thing. It's not a part of civil society, which immediately makes me think of Wilderson, right? The slave is a thing and the proletariat is a person, right? And the proletariat is at a different stage of development. That is a very racist evolutionary statement, right? That is informing how the worker even comes to being, right? In relationship to a thing, right? So this is already a racially charged ontological statement. And again, we could think about Western thought's reliance on the human being external to the world or separate so it can grasp it and know it, thinking about consciousness and intellect. And then being active, right? And that active place has an advantage over animals and nature, which are passive. And what I want to argue is that Black feminists and Native feminists can get us around these kinds of entrapments. So certainly people could argue that there are critical Marxists who have already said Marx is really humanist in this 1844 text. Nancy Hartsock has said that, some white feminists have said that. There's a new article from Antipode by Eckers and Leftis that says that. But to get at the ways that Darwin's racial statements really infused Marxist thinking, in the ways that this kind of ontology and this violence towards animals in the land, you have to go to other kinds of bodies of thought, particularly Black feminists and Native feminists, who will not allow their tradition to read Marx as an ecological thinker, right? So it's critical to do this work, particularly for the ecological socialist, right? Where there's still a human functioning there, right? You gotta go back to Black and Native feminist thought. So some of the claims I'm making is that in that statement, we've seen how, again, the individuals resurfaced and valued, a racial order, an ontological order, but there's also this function of work which could possibly lead us to property. I didn't focus on this, but in this third line, through this production, nature appears as his work and his reality. I'm thinking about that as a statement of property making, right? There's something about the way the worker and work can produce property, the very thing that communism wants to destroy. So we got to think about that too, right? Again, this primacy of work giving humans dignity and legibility is something that certainly Native feminists and Black feminists can help us think about, but also I would want to bring in the scholarship of disability studies, disability justice, specifically crip theory, to think about why people derive value and dignity from work and labor, right? And there are other kinds of ways of being that don't rely or are not allowed to access work. So they have to draw their dignity and humanity from different forms, right? And not to recuperate humanity on other terms, but to get to crip theory of work, right? As a particular kind of liberal entrapment is important. And I think generally work thinking with Shona Jackson, again, erases some really important Black and Indigenous struggles, material struggles against being made a thing for Black folks. And then genocide and conquest, thank you for focusing on that key word, Bavasa, like, yes, conquest specifically, right? Samasa, thank you. But the worker settler labors across the land and across Indigenous bodies, right? And I'm going back to, like, you know, Frank Wilderson, Red, White, and Black from 2010, not even where Frank is now, but that making of the clearing is done by a worker, right? And we have to think about that in movements. Really, organized labor has to think about that. So turning to As We Have Always Done, which is a text that I get so much from each time that I read it, and want to be in contact with Leanne Simpson about how I'm reading it before I publish it, because this offers so many constellations and is not only meant to be read for my uses to critique the work, but in reading it this time, I was really struck by this chapter on Anishinaabe anti-capitalism. And at the beginning of this chapter is really interesting because Leanne Simpson is talking about preparing herself to talk to Naomi Klein. And Naomi Klein wants to interview her for Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything. I think it's Capitalism versus Climate at the time. And Leanne Simpson is talking about how nervous she is to talk to Naomi Klein, who is really versed in capitalism and anti-capitalist critique and has read Marx, but then works herself out of it through the process of both talking to Naomi Klein, but reflecting on her own tradition about how that is a kind of cognitive imperialism, right? To kind of be shook by the Marxist and a Marxist critique of capital, right? And then I read in this chapter that she is reaffirming Indigenous people's expertise in anti-capitalism, right? And says we have thousands and thousands of years of experience, right? And have lived outside of global capitalism for thousands of years. And then later in the chapter, you see her reflecting on her conversation with Naomi Klein, where Naomi Klein is trying to offer some alternatives to the kind of extractivist relationship that particularly specifically white Canadians have to land, and is offering up stewardship. And Leanne Simpson says, well, you know, I thought about that. I heard her. I appreciate what she's saying because they're colleagues, they're friends, and I'm not trying to set them up as antagonists, but she's like, stewardship is too narrow. It's too simplistic. And I want to go back to that passage because if you think about it, that kind of stewardship can come out of a worker ontology, right? I can appreciate that I need to protect the ecology for me. It has a kind of, stewardship has a kind of sentimentalism to it, right? It's a very liberal, I want to protect this thing that's lower than me because it can be a resource for me. And so it's not getting to the kind of grounded normativity and relationality that she's talking about in her work, right? And that she's talking about within Anishinaabe kind of understandings of human relationality, right? And so in a chapter called Land as Pedagogy, there is this story that Leanne Simpson inherited and retells, and has retold time and time again. I've watched Leanne Simpson retell this story. Benujan makes a lovely discovery about 5 different times. I heard her do it recently in 2019, and this human relative Benujan, their gender changes, their name changes, what Leanne Simpson tells about this story changes. But Leanne Simpson is also talking about the ways that Anishinaabe people are makers, right? And so that let me think about this particular scene outside of labor and outside of work, to think about making and creativity and collaborative creation as an alternative to work. And so from some context for this story is that Benujan is going out to collect firewood, right? So it's collecting limbs. And during the process, actually lies down to rest, right? And if you look at the first column, and lying down is actually looking up. So from jump, there is a difference in orientation, literally just in time and space. The human relative is looking up at nature, right? So it's a flip from that Marxist notion of the human working upon something. So there's already a radical reorientation, right, of space, and looks up and sees Ajidamu, who's up in the tree, right? So Ajidamu is a squirrel in this context. And you notice Ajidamu actually has its own world-making capacity and time space. Ajidamu collects nuts, builds nests, looks after young. There's a whole world there. So again, the animal is not passive. It's an active being that has its own kind of time space. And it's a kind of being that Binujan respects and then mimics, right? So it pays attention to its nibble, nibble, suck, and it's curious about it and wants to be in alignment with it, not separate from it, right? That is a critical distinction, right? There's an alignment with it to know from it, to understand it as teacher. And I think that it's so important to revisit this kind of work, the aesthetic work, the critical kind of theoretical work, the work that lends itself to the particular kind of praxis of Indigenous insurgents, and then going back to what Black feminists are doing, who often broadly, and I'm not talking about all Black feminists, but particularly Black feminists that are abolitionists, get lumped in with liberal Black feminists. And they are making some of the most radical kinds of critiques of liberal subjectivity, particularly through work, and the kinds of liberalisms that Marxists are trying to get over but keep reproducing, right? There's a reason why when we talk about the working class, it's always white people. It's really in these ontological statements that we really have to interrogate and perhaps get beyond. So I don't know how long I've been talking, but I'm gonna stop there so we can breathe and have a discussion, but thank you.
Honestly, I've never been more frustrated about the lack of the sound of applause. I wish I had a track, right, ready for you as soon as you finish. Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to remind folks that if you have questions, to slowly begin to send them our way so I can think through what folks are thinking about after that. And Alyssa wants to say something too, but I just want to say thank you. And we're about to begin the conversation Q&A.
Yeah, that was great. Really ready to dive in and have a little circle of learning and I'm sure growth for all of us in here. So let's see what kind of questions folks have. I can also start out. I don't want to get too messy, but I read the interview between you and Frank in Otherwise Worlds, and I'm just interested to hear how your trajectory of study and thinking changed, because I know that was a couple years before the book was published. And then that's a year and some change ago from today. So I'm interested broadly in what are sort of the tensions, the interstices in your thinking between what could be a bit reductively called Black objection and native sovereignty.
No, thank you, Samantha. And I do want to say I'm serious about reading Marx with you. I want to as I'm on this journey. No, it's, where am I now? I'm still thinking with Frank's newest work. So was just listening to Frank at the Franklin Humanities Center at Duke, which I thought was a fire talk. I feel like I'm still at an impasse because there was something very rigorous and critical about Frank's engagement with Native studies that I value. And I valued and I still do. And I'm still kind of stuck and in place with a Wilderson of 2010 on that configuration of the half human, half non-human Indigenous figure, because I see some of that articulation from Native feminists that I know, right? Who will have a conversation with me with like, I know, like talking about land, which can often lead to territory and a world, is tough. And we got to think together about why that creates problems, right? So on the ground, the ways that we can talk, for me, exceeds like this newer kind of adjustment that I appreciate Frank making with thinking with Jared, that the Native can be a part of civil society through sovereignty. But I would say yes, through sovereignty, but folks who are like, I'm really not trying to reach for that. And that's why I'm really attached to Billy Ray Belcour's work, who is like, I really can't use sovereignty and be full-throated about it and use it as a political term because it actually fucks me up around some stuff. So I still hold out hope, even though Frank is like, no, sorry, it's not gonna work, right? While I appreciate the memoir kind of auto theory work that he's doing, I thought that if Frank had kind of leaned into 5 civilized tribes and enslavement, it like could have gotten me there on his argument about how some Native people have been able to make themselves as human through sovereignty via Black enslavement. But the story about him and his father, that didn't work for me in this particular book. And like him going back and doing some more work around Indigenous slavery, not just thinking about Black people being enslaved, but the ways that Indigenous folks were made slaves too. I have a friend and colleague, and I know it was and he would argue that would be a conditional kind of, that shit is about land, the fact that you got enslaved. But there are artistic and other kinds of narratives. Why am I drawing a blank? This is like my favorite person. Oh my gosh, they're in Canada right now. Oh, Zainab Amadahi, whose ancestors, both Cherokee and Black, were enslaved on the same plantation in Green, Virginia, right? So I'm like, Frank is actually the kind of theorist that could go back to that scene of Cherokee enslavement and Black enslavement on that plantation and pick that apart. Like, I'm interested in Frank doing some critical work around that instead of creating this category of the Black non-human and Indigenous people needing the Black non-human in the same ways that white and other people of color settlers do. That's getting clunky for me, Samasa. Like, I get it, I wanna be there, but I'm kind of still stuck. But on his critiques of Marxism and labor, I'm right there, I'm 100%. There's a way that the communist proposes and presumes to be able to do too much in the world that's gonna free everybody. And I just don't believe that, I don't. Yeah. But again, I'm still a part of United Campus Workers. I'm still gonna make sure they send money to this campaign because I'm living in this moment and my university was trying to kill me and put me in the classroom, right? So you gotta use what you got.
Thank you. I know Samasa, you said it was going to be a little bit of team, but I think that was just a beautiful exploration of why we love the plethora of Black scholars that we get to think with. And honestly, one of the reasons why we're thinking with you here. I have a couple of questions coming in. So I do want to ask one question about, like, to put the FUC in conversations with your presentation. What sort of theories underpin Black feminism and Native feminism that helps us to push labor movements to a conversation about abolition? I know that's the work that I've been interested in since I, participated in direct actions for the strike and created some as well. So I'm interested in the ways in which labor actions are transformed through to abolitionist movements. And I'm hoping that you can offer some understandings of Black and Native feminisms, critiques of labor a little bit more, because that's one of the questions that we have coming in to say, can we say a bit more about the Black feminist and Native feminist analytics?
I can speak and link some of my experiences as a Black worker at GSU, and think about how I understand that through Black feminism. I'm not going to necessarily do so much speaking on Indigenous feminisms and how they interface with organized labor in the plantation. And yes, that was not a slippage, in the plantation university space. But this moment, trying to understand yourself as solely a worker during a pandemic just falls apart sometimes. Like while there was a swelling of the roles within the UCW in Georgia and at Georgia State because of the pandemic, there was also organizing just on the behalf of Black people who were trying to stay alive, who never talked to one another. So this was also, and never thought about themselves collectively because of the way that work segregated us, right? And some of the limitations of the idea of work separates, even in a false sense, and Marxists will say that separates people who do intellectual labor from people who do a kind of labor on the facilities, but also the ways that we often struggle to think about students as potential laborers, but all of that kind of broke down when we were trying to keep other Black people out of the university space, because we were thinking about our relationship to our sick and disabled children and elders that we shared household with. So we were thinking about our kinship circles and protecting them, not because they were workers, because we didn't want them to die from a virus. So that was a different kind of materialism. So I'm challenging folks to think about, if we have another shutdown, for instance, and we cannot work, right, in a university space, what other kinds of subjectivities emerge for us when it's not oriented around work, but a stoppage of work, right? And also to think about the ways that even the right rallies around a particular kind of workerism, which should be alarming, this kind of let's get back to work. What's the primacy of work, and how does that category draw all of us together, the fascists and the communists at work? Like, we need to work on and think through that category, right? So some other things were allowed to emerge for us during this pandemic around how do we become caregivers? How do we do mutual aid when it's not just about how do you protect yourself as a worker? It became about these other kinds of things that the UCW couldn't always satisfy for us, right? Or that our union couldn't always satisfy for us. It was other kinds of attachments and kinships that we had to think about.
I love that. I think like shifting our ideas, not even shift. I mean, I'm not shifting. I'm focusing on methods of care, right? Like how to keep my family, how to keep my friends that look like me, that's across the United States at different moments of the time, the so-called United States, healthy and alive, or at least supported. And I think these often exceed our networks of labor, our work networks, right? They exceed our ability to even literally pay for our desires and what we need to support each other, right? So labor for me can also be about, like, it obscures the way in which, like, some of what we need just ain't about work. Like, it's about, like, you need to, it's just what you need sometimes doesn't include that. So thank you. The next question we have is about time. And so this person wanted to say thank you for allowing us the time to rest and breathe through and let these things settle, right? And they're asking and thinking about Munoz's concept of queer time, disabilities theories, critiques of labor and time, and then how Black and Native critiques of labor challenge settler colonial white supremacist heteronormative conceptions of time. So the question is, how much pressure is there on intellectuals to be able to respond because of these productive chronologies?
No, that's such a deep question. Right, the time of labor in the university I'm thinking about, even during a pandemic, have been to produce towards, for me in my situation, the tenure clock. And I've seen a lot of, weird workerism just transfer to like digital form. Like I've seen people overperforming and how they're going to be better teachers in Zoom space and Skype space. And when this moment could give us a chance to be like, and this is for me, speaking to me, to calm the fuck down, seriously, to calm down. And I think why I would keep going, and this is, I'm thinking with Samasa right now, why I would value Indigenous feminist thought is like, if I go back to that, Benojan scene of making something, like there are different times and different worlds that we can be attentive to. Like if I'm thinking of Ajidamu's like gathering, caring for children, sucking on the branch, like there are other modes of time available to us that we can't even cognitively tap into within a frame of work, right? It blocks out other kinds of time, which is still something that Marxists are on point with, right? But there's something about the other kinds of times, dimensions that I'm invested in Black worldings. So that's another kind of separation for what I think Frank is saying about Blackness's incapacity. Like I am, and not that people are gonna recognize them, but I feel like in other kinds of kinship networks of care, other kinds of time is available, whether it's recognized or not. And we could also certainly get punished for it, but there's something else about time that certainly work constraints, or even the idea of just a strike, right? It doesn't fuck with time in the ways that perhaps the person who asked the question about Munoz and other frames, critical frames around time, can get us to. So just the capacity for Black folks in everyday struggle to create new modes of time is something that I'm attached to. I remember, I think I was listening to it yesterday, Frank was like, we also got to get at our attachment. So I still do have a desire rooted in a Black kind of capacity to make something else, to be on a different rhythm. I don't know if that answered the person's question, and if they want to come back at me again, please do.
Okay, we're definitely still taking questions, so feel free to message free in the chat. I think, Dr. King, I'm also interested to hear you talk about method and analysis, and particularly one of the things that enthralled me in reading The Black Shoals is your the way you demonstrate how to read practice, like the red paint being thrown on the statue of Christopher Columbus, as well as Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust and Indigo. And so can you talk about what does it mean for Black study to work analytically across such varying mediums, And I guess I'm also interested in color as well, because that just came up to me in thinking about those two scenes in particular.
No, thank you, Samasa, for that. Like, I'm thinking about when you said working across like form, genre, space, and text, like, are some Black studies scholars' investments in a particular kind of being undisciplined, right? And using your training against itself to do some improvisation, right? And think about, put something down, think about it, return to it, rub things together that don't necessarily make sense, which often is just a part of struggling as a Black person, making shit do, like the stuff that you have available and making that work was definitely a part of that process. Also, as for folks who are working on these longer projects like dissertations and MA thesis, coming back to something over and over and over and over again. And then also paying attention to what you think is a moment where you're not consciously working on something, because that's where ideas and like some of your creative juices are most active, like in the shower, right before bed, driving. And that's where some of these abilities to make these associations and leaps came from, like during those moments where I wasn't actively at the computer, actively reading, actively storyboarding something, charting something, and then having that idea and then reading something quirky that you just don't think makes sense for what you're doing and having that open up something else. So the kind of commitment to being undisciplined, I think, is something important that comes from our field of Black study, that kind of improvisation. And also tracking the practice, like the on the ground stuff, like the fact that Black activists were fucking up these Confederate statues meant something to me back in 2018, 2019, after Charleston, and even before this moment of uprising that we're having. And I'm just thinking about, Samasa, thank you for helping me think about the ways that statues and monuments are being attacked right now. And I've been listening to some, this sounds like an aside, but it is about that first cenotaph of Columbus that I start off the book with. But there is an ease at which even folks, white anti-capitalist anarchists, will attack those particular monuments. And this is for our city, so I'm not speaking for all white folks in struggle, but I have heard this year in particular, particularly after the murder of Rayshard Brooks and the actions that happened the day after, that white folks had to be dragged to stand in front of Black people who are facing off the police. Like literally people on bullhorns were like, why are you standing around? Why won't you get up there and stand in front of us and protect us, right? And then again, we're willing to burn down the Wendy's in the Pittsburgh neighborhood in Southwest Atlanta, which is 80% Black, 35% poverty rate, but won't burn down the Beltline, right? Which is a 22-mile monstrosity that is fueling gentrification, that is mostly white, won't burn down the Wells Fargo in Virginia Highland, right? Won't burn down any of those businesses, the hipster breweries, the little cocktail shops, but will do stuff to the Starbucks, which is easy. But when it comes to their own, again, the bourgeois white body, it could be a worker as property, won't put that on the front line and won't attack bourgeois property, right? Again, you got to bring this fight home. So I want to return to some of those symbols. It's easy to pull down Columbus. It's easy to go after these Confederate statues, but these gentrified white neighborhoods become sacred, right? And so also thinking about the things that Black people have been ripping down, right? The lengths to which Black people put their lives on the line all the time, right? is the kind, that's the material from which my study comes from, right? And then I can move out from that to think about what kind of symbolic meaning that has. Samasa, that's how I'm thinking about, that's where you made me go right now. But, yeah. And I want to say that the Black organizers I was listening to are marking a moment in time. They did say that white folks from 2014 to 2017 in the city were ready to throw down. It's something about 2020, after Rayshard Brooks, white people were acting up and flaking. Documented, right? In the intercepts. We had to yell at y'all to get on the line. Y'all ran when the police were throwing tear gas. Y'all were the first to run. Nothing is burning in gentrified Atlanta right now. Not a thing.
I have unmuted myself, but I'm gonna like sit, like we need to sit with that for a little bit.
No, Brie, I feel you. And that's easy. That's already within the Marxist tradition. You got to destroy bourgeois culture totally. Like, even if you don't read Afro-pessimism or Black studies, like, be faithful to Marx and Engels. Destroy all that shit if you're going to be a good communist, right? So you don't even got to lean in on us. Just do the work, right?
I have a couple of questions and then two people who want to speak. So I'm gonna let the two like audience members speak. So that's Amaris and Crystal in that order. And then I'll ask the two questions.
Hi, Professor King. Thank you so much for this offering. I was just like slapping away at a question because I didn't know I was going to get to speak. Hi. So I actually wanted to just thank you for, in preparation for today, I just reread some of your work and my favorite chapter about porosity. And I think that there's a really incredible examination there of fungibility and kind of folds into what you're saying here about a kind of new orientation for looking at or being with work and working bodies or refusing them. So what have I tried to say? Yeah, so I wanted to bring you into the fold of an embodied lab that just commenced, organized by the scholar Malaika Imhotep at UC Berkeley. And so Ra draws from the Combahee River Collective's question, and she asks, how might we use our position from the bottom to make a clear leap towards revolutionary action? So Ra's Supine Possibilities Lab calls to mind this imagery from Simpson about lying down and looking up, right? And this kind of register of rest. And I wanted you to say more about what Black and Indigenous feminisms and this kind of telling ourselves a different story about what rest and restfulness as a kind of abolitionist mode has to offer, right? It seems counterintuitive, right? And so, yeah, there was something about the imagery of that story. And of course, in the test, we're invited to practice the supine and think about, like, you know, what will call us into the revolution from this place of rest, or at least lying on our backs. So I just wanted to like bring you into the fold of that lab and just kind of, I don't know, ask you kind of what you think about that position and any sort of things that come up for you also in reading that story. Yeah.
No, Maurice, thank you. Good to see you again. It was June. I had no idea I'd run into you. So please email me about that project, about that lab. It sounds fascinating. And to not be reductive, as you were talking, made me think about the NAP ministry, which I think is a Black feminist project that my friend JJ Ford introduced me to. And there was probably something very profound there, because it makes me think about what I was able to do creatively on an embodied level, a cerebral and deep kind of other level, emotionally, spiritually, when I'm not actively trying to force something, right? So in a drive down a road I've been driving over and over again, I could have then a kind of desire to look up and notice something, right? Not that I was supine or in full rest, but I wasn't in the usual active mode of thought that I was usually am in creating this work. But also, yeah, going back to Simpson's scene of making, and I love that Simpson is thinking about making and doesn't immediately go to work, right? And let that overwrite what's happening. But that place of laying down is so critical to the possibility of learning and being open, and then understanding where maple syrup comes from, right? So that position of the supine, right, or that position of laying down allows you to perhaps be porous and more open, right, to receive and be receptive and not be afraid in what we might call a human receptivity of not always being active and penetrating and projecting yourself out to let stuff in. So, and I want to, now that you said that, I want to go back to that chapter and think with it on another layer. But I would love to look at the work that the lab is doing on restfulness, right? And reframing that is not passiveness, but as something else. Creative and restoring, right? And a kind of opening. So, no, that's a beautiful question and a beautiful provocation.
And then Crystal, I think also that might have messaged me too. So if you didn't intend to speak, I can read your question out loud if you write me again really quickly. While I'm figuring that out, we have a question that begins with a thank you. And it's thinking about your use of Belcourt earlier today and the articulation of the affective commons at the site of loneliness, of the dehumanized, the subjugated, and the affective commons providing a potential for the world making outside of empire, colonialism, racial capitalism. I wanted to ask how the problematic of sovereignty you described earlier, a radical commons at the site of affective loneliness, does attach to land as property. They're not sure if that makes all the way sense, but they're thinking about this in connection to the questions about practices of care I was thinking of naming earlier. So kind of thinking about what is this affective commons have to do with the problematic of sovereignty, and is sort of an alternative to sovereignty care, or where can we think through that?
I'm not sure if this person is online or willing to, because I'm wondering if they could give me some more context for the affective commons. Are they drawing right from Billy Ray Belcourt, or I understand other aspects of the question, but I just wanted to ask them more about that articulation of the affective commons and who offers it and who can embrace it a little bit. And I love the question. I'm not trying to swerve on them. I just want to talk with them a little bit more.
Hi, Professor King. I'm the person who asked this question, and I'm sorry, it's sort of like a confusing question because I think I'm still kind of thinking through a little bit with it. So I recently read and also had a chance to be in conversation with my professor and, like other students that, are in her seminar. And the seminar is around sort of broadly decolonial love. And we read This Wound is a World by Billy Ray Balcourt. And it was sort of like my first introduction to Billy Ray Balcourt. So I really love the way that he pushes ways of thinking that really in a lot of different ways exceed sort of these boundary makings that happen, both like I think in activist work and then also like in critical theory and like work where we're applying like theoretical analytics to understand like material life. So in like the epilogue of This Wound is a World, Belcourt gets into a discussion about how the feeling of loneliness, how the and the experience of that, how and particularly for people who have been dehumanized or subjugated through logics of otherness, etc., through capital, empire making, settler colonialism, how they're he's seeming to like argue and champion for a way of like building commons or perhaps even kinships at the site of that sort of feeling or affect of loneliness. And I was thinking about what we were talking about earlier in terms of like sovereignty, land, and the complications with that in terms of Black and Indigenous struggle. And then also like thinking about like how, like the sort of like popularity or rise of like mutual aid has become like very popular in like right now pandemic reality, and how maybe that might be connected to this sort of like affective commons that I think Belcourt is signaling as like a site for like world making in a way that exceeds these sorts of like constrictions or bounds of like ways that orient our life through capitalism and settler colonialism.
No, thank you for that. Thank you so much. Yeah, I am continuing my relationship with Belcourt with joy, but you made me think about let me not say shared experience, the high rates of death for Indigenous folks, particularly the Navajo Nation, through the pandemic, and Black folks. Also, if you go to death at the hands, murder, homicide at the hands of the police state. I think that might be a space of affectability. And again, thinking, I'm very wedded, you could tell, to red, white, and Black. Like this space of being positioned closer to the horizon of death and being an affectable body, as Denise De Silva would term it, is something that Black bodies have had to bear. I would argue it's something that Indigenous bodies have had to bear, particularly on this continent. That position of affectability might be the space of an effective commons, right? Particularly if, and I'm thinking specifically the work of not just Belcourt, but Karen Recollect, who does this incredible work with the Cree story of Sky Woman about falling, and has a different orientation towards cosmology in the sky rather than being invested in land or terra as territory. There are other kinds of modes of Native resistance to death and Black resistance to death, or Black experiences with being positioned closer to death, that speak to Native experiences being close in position to death that I think can certainly be in conversation. So certainly you and I share an affinity for Belcour, who does that, but there are Indigenous thinkers who think about land and dissolving notions of sovereignty at the same time. I don't feel like, I feel like Black studies and Native studies has to have a conversation about land and ecology beyond the terms that we've given us to create what you might be thinking of as like an effective commons, to think about effectability and our relationship to our materiality in the world and life on other terms, right? So I think what you're asking me is productive and having me go back and do some reading. So both thinking with the limits that Wilderson is laying out about that impossibility, but also thinking with poets and thinking with creators about how to, because Billy Ray Belcour is talking about how to at every moment try to be avoiding death and the kind of loneliness that creates. And I remember the way that he described Leslie Marmon Silko's loneliness in Red, White, and Black that I found really compelling, right? That civil society could not deal with. And certainly if you listen to not just Leslie Marmon Silko, but Hunani K. Trask, like their register, even if it comes up within the discourse of settler colonialism, is speaking to a different kind of suffering and loss that exceeds what we think is land and sovereignty and political legibility. So I like that your attention is on Belcour and aesthetics, because it opens up some other registers. And that register of effectability or an effective commons might be there in that kind of art. Does that make sense?
So we've got another person who wants to speak. Crystal, going to unmute you now.
Hi. Thank you for this talk. It's really productive for me to think with. I just had a quick question about what I see as three figures that are like similarly positioned in Marx in terms of being foundational to his conceptualization of labor, but also being disavowed. And I'm thinking about the figure of the enslaved that you talked about, but also that of the prostitute and the lumpen proletariat. And it's just really striking to me the way in which those three figures are almost, they're like so pervasive in the text, and the very conception of labor is kind of dependent upon them, but they are also violently abjected, I would say. And I was wondering, they are like critics of Marx's category of work and labor that can come from all of those three figures, but what kind of pressure points and point of articulation do you see across those three figures instead of presuming their separability, and taking also into account the fact that some bodies are made to occupy all three positions at once?
Sorry, can folks hear me now? Okay. No, I'll try again. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part of your question. I think it's my fault. My computer was turned down when I turned it up. I could hear you talking about the lumpen proletariat. So I might ask you to repeat the first part of the question, or please do if I haven't gotten it right. But you're saying, if I read those, how do you think the articulation between the figures of the prostitute, the lumpen proletariat, how they incite differently situated critiques of Marx, or critiques of work specifically? That's a good question. And I haven't thought about those terms. I haven't thought about those terms outside of what the Black Panther Party, or even kinds of really cool work the Black feminists are doing around, specifically, I want to name Zalika's work, who's at UT Austin, around the hoe right now, right? This figure who is rejecting work and rejecting a respectable kind of working subjectivity. But certainly there are statements within Marx's body of work that talks about, you know, people being able to work to the capacity that they can, where a disabled figure may arise. So I think there's possibility, but the ontological terms of that, I'm not sure that they're really getting at the foundation of the violence that work produces, right? It might be an argument about the violence of exclusion from that category, how to understand the values of that category. But I think the critique is different. Can you articulate maybe the critique that they bring a little bit more for me, since I didn't hear the first part of your question? Like, what is, for instance, the prostitute that you have here, what is it arguing? And you have it positioned alongside the slave, so it's not the same position, but it's doing something else. And I also just feel like I'm rambling, so I want to get on track.
Hello, can you hear me?
It's a little low. If you can maybe mess with your audio a little bit.
Is it better now?
Yeah, it's better.
It is.
So, okay, thank you. So it's not that there are like critiques of work per se in those three figures. It's more that there is, I think, something intriguing in how all three figures reappear constantly in Marx, and often through like metaphors or like comparisons as a way to prop up a specific conceptualization of what work or labor is. And I just think that the focus on those three figures in particular to do some kind of rhetorical or like metaphorical work is interesting. And from those three figures, there are different possibilities of critiquing work, but I'm more interested in how some bodies are made to occupy all three positions at once. And Zalika's work that you're mentioning, I think, is interesting in that regard, the positioning of the black hole. But yeah, I was more interested in hearing what you think, what are the possibilities in like articulating a critique of work from those three figures all at once instead of separately.
No, Crystal, thank you. Okay, thank you. That ghostly part and like the ways that they haunt Marx's work is so beautifully stated. And I think it's critical to think about that, like what Marx is disavowing or trying to keep outside. For me, that your question brings that up. And that makes me think about a lot of things, particularly, and I can think most clearly about it from the position of the slave, right? That gets rendered as a thing or raw material. All of those things coming together, the lumpen proletariat, the hoe, and the slave would be fascinating to think with, like what kind of critique could emerge from there, because that could bring in a particular kind of sexualized difference, not at the register of the human, but a sexualized difference to other them, particularly if they all kind of come together at the space of the slave, thinking about them together. That's brilliant. I think that work needs to be done. But on the haunt part, because that's just where my imagination is going, I think it's part of like the deep anxieties of what the abolition of slavery, particularly Black insurrection, was doing on the scene while Marx was operating, on a very material level, like the fact that the slave had to be disavowed is because if you kind of understood the slave's humanity, Marx and Engels would have to rethink, like just literally how they were funding their work and how they were funding work with the Communist League. Like Engels's father, like racking in money in that textile mill, right? From slavery, right? The cotton that's coming from the Americas is making that textile mill and the exploitation of white labor possible, those textile mills. So there is, I think like in a very material sense, a way of disavowing that position. And I'm gonna stick with the slave here in order not to do an other kind of political work around the abolition of slavery, right? And so weighing in as a journalist is different than literally throwing in all of your weight and being full-throated about the abolition of slavery and really understanding it, not as an economic engine, but like the way that it was haunting his actual life, like where that cotton was coming from and where his money was coming from. Like if I think about it as a cultural studies and literary studies scholar, like on a psychic level, like the slave is always with you in your bourgeois humanity. And like to have to constantly work to disavow that is, I think, where that ghostliness is coming up in their work. So I'm sorry I like verged off into like Marx as a writer and a theorist and didn't get to the lumpen proletariat and the prostitute because I just can't do all that right now. But I think that's a fascinating question, and how those figures haunt differently and might haunt in a different way if you think all of them together, or if they might come into a Black body is like, that's deep. That's fascinating, Crystal. We can talk more for sure, but thank you for that.
Thank you all. I think we're just about at the end of our time, actually. So I wanted to check in before I offered any more of Professor King's energy, intellectual, emotional, energetic, or otherwise. So this last question, I think I'm going to bring together some of the themes from other folks, but in thinking particularly about Black worlds and Black worlding, and moving beyond just working, right? And we've explored that together today. But even beyond individual ideals of liberalism and stewardship, right? How do you see, and how do you, what can you offer us to continue to think through Black feminist critiques of labor as our identity, right? So I want to come back to that opening question, right? What does it mean for Black folks, for Indigenous folks? I mean, if you want to speak to that, you don't have to, but for Black folks, for Black feminists to take seriously a legacy that shows up beyond work. And you mentioned it in terms of rest, care, but I do want to end on that question, right?
Yeah, I mean, you made me think about Saidiya Hartman, Wayward Lives, right? Just the kinds of worlds that those Black girls were creating, right? And their refusal, right, to wed their identity into one of a worker. Like we've been doing it, right? And so, yeah, and I'm speaking specifically from that radical, particular kind of Black gender tradition, right? Being made female flesh, which makes me think about how Hartman and Scenes of Subjection got to fungibility, right? And did it specifically in its critique of like, you can't just think about slaveness or the state of being enslaved through labor. You have to think about the multiple ways that Blackness is used parasitically by whiteness, and got that from Toni Morrison, right? Got that from reading playing in the dark, right? And then Toni Morrison, right, is not someone to foreclose Black world making, right? So even our genealogies of fungibility or things that critique work, or even stuff around Black women, Black femmes, Black trans folks, Black gender nonconforming folks resisting work, has a tradition in creating other kinds of worlds, right? So thinking about that deep archival work that Sadia Hartman is doing, thinking about people on the ground who are doing incredible things. Again, thinking about that NAP ministry, but the ways that we are coming together, particularly as Black folks, and I'm feeling how we're building new networks of care for one another during this pandemic is really, really important, right? And it's not something that's just newly emerged, but it's something that we're building off of, a tradition that we're building off of, right? Is not invested in the labor that we do for one another, but in a particular kind of presence, right, and care. Thank you, Bree, for that question. Thank you for y'all's questions.
I see a couple of notes coming in as your last comment. Everything you say draws the eyes, draws the ears. Thank you so much for being with us today. I want to let Samasa say a few words to close out too, but I want to at least bring in the last voices to honor everybody who wanted to participate, and I'll talk with them. But they want to leave you with this question about theft of wage, of labor, of the body, of land. And maybe at another time later, in the year, maybe we'll see you again. We can re-explore this idea of, what do you do when those processes of building worlds are stolen, are thieved away from the body, from the material? And how do we continue to build from that? This is my summarization, but I offer that to remind folks in this call right now that this work that people are figuring out isn't something that will manifest overnight, right? There are processes and steps, again, from the settler state that interfere with even this conversation that we're having right now. So so on that note, I want us to think about what are the loopholes of retreat that we still have, and is this one of them, or can we build another one? And want to thank everyone for participating in our little moment of retreating, of resting. And I hope that, some of y'all lied down, walked around, cooked while y'all took this call, and really move away from Zoom as a place where you need to be upright all the time. Even if you wanted to be attentive, I was like, oh, maybe I need to have my camera on the whole time. So many people are just upright. I gotta be a good scholar. I gotta set the right tone as a facilitator. So I do wanna honor everybody that showed up today. To think critically about abolition, to think about the UC as a site of violence, as education as a site of, not as the site, but as the method of violence, of epistemology, is hard. So thank you all, and I'll let Samasa offer some closings, and I look forward to seeing some of your faces in another call.
I ain't got too much to say, me and Bree, we both from North Carolina though, so we right, ain't too far from y'all over there in Georgia. Just wanted to throw that out there. But we're so grateful for your time, Dr. King. And yeah, let's keep on keeping on, everybody.